Hello, good evening. Welcome to the 84 Million podcast. Tonight we have a special guest with us. We found him on Twitter. Why Litecoin? I can't give you any other details than that, but I can say that he is an author at markettruth.medium.com, has a history in economics, finance, and I imagine as a hobby, music, or professionally perhaps. And I think the idea of his account initially was to discuss Litecoin as a Bitcoin substitute. So again, we have Why Litecoin with us here. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Kyle, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. So we kind of chatted a little bit before we went on here just about kind of what brought you to Twitter or why you're interested in Litecoin. Of course, we're here to discuss Litecoin. This is a Litecoin podcast. But maybe we want to unpack your account a little bit. Perhaps I didn't give you justice on that introduction.
Oh no, I know I didn't give you much to work with, and there's not a lot to find on the online. But yeah, that's a good general description. I guess in more detail, like I started in the crypto space, like getting really interested in like late 2016, early 2017. But kind of first heard about cryptocurrency prior to that, kind of like everyone, right? You go through like multiple cycles before you really get interested and start learning things. So like I read about it in college in like 2013, 2014, and then late 2016, 2017 is where I got like heavily interested after seeing price continually go up. But yeah, I turned my focus to Litecoin like I think it was in like spring of 2017 or mid 2017. It's when Bitcoin blocks started to become full. And then there was like the Bitcoin like block wars and block size debate. And that pushed me on towards Litecoin. Originally, I found that there weren't very many people who really understood like the Litecoin value proposition. And so for a while in 2017, actually for multiple years then after, I had really struggled to meet anyone or find anyone online that was promoting Litecoin as a Bitcoin substitute. So my opinion was always the same. I know originally Litecoin was hated on and it got a lot of negative media and attention for being basically like a Bitcoin clone or Bitcoin copycat. And so I think that's why Litecoin supporters steered away from that narrative. But to me, that was always the main kind of value proposition of Litecoin, if that makes sense.
Yeah, indeed. And I just want to put a comment out to our viewers on YouTube. This is our first interview where we don't have an actual physical moving animated individual, and that's of course by choice. Our guest wishes to remain somewhat anonymous, but this is new for me, so bear with me. And perhaps just refer to the audio podcast. Again, you can go to 84million.com/podcast and find, I believe we're on 13 different channels. So if you'd prefer to listen only, I think this would be an appropriate episode to do that. But either way, I just wanted to kind of shout that out for our visual folks here. This is Why Litecoin's Twitter background, if we want to know what that is, the Bitcoin and the Litecoin, kind of the coin. And of course, you can find him at twitter.com/WLitecoin. Curious, just speaking about Twitter, and this is a little bit off topic, it's not my notes. And again, for everybody, we have kind of a general set of questions. Why Litecoin and I briefly discussed kind of an outline, but most of this will just be as it comes, an organic conversation between two individuals in the Litecoin community. And we're looking forward to it. But just speaking of Twitter, have you seen, like you said, some folks weren't always interested in Litecoin, or very few people were interested in Litecoin. Of those who were interested when you came onto Twitter or online forums or platforms where Litecoin was discussed, do you still see anyone here today that was there at the time that you joined, or was there a lot of turnover?
That's an interesting question, and I'm trying to think right now. I know Shan created that master BTC LTC account like December of 2017.
Okay.
So I remember him. He's been the longest kind of sheer supporter of of Litecoin that I can remember. There's also like Loshan and Charlie Lee, obviously, that have been around a while. There was a guy named like MLP Franklin that I really liked, but I haven't seen him since like 2020. But yeah, Jinji Wang, like comes to mind. A lot of the original Litecoin supporters, but none of them ever, even Charlie Lee promoted Bitcoin as, or Litecoin as a Bitcoin substitute. So I always disagreed with almost everyone in the whole community. Everyone originally tried to market Litecoin as something different, and it is, but to me, they're very small, arbitrary changes, when in fact, like the security model and most of its, fundamental features are nearly identical.
Indeed, indeed, indeed. Maybe we want to discuss that. Hopefully, it won't disturb where we're going. But again, we're going to take this as a dance. And the idea of Litecoin as a Bitcoin substitute. Why don't you just talk a little bit about that, and then we'll go on to my question.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. So the best way I think to describe this is, and really understand it, is starting with Bitcoin. So like Bitcoin's unique in a lot of different ways to traditional forms of money. Like it's very different to dollars or gold or silver, the money we've become used to like transacting with and have a history to look back on. Like one, there's no other money in the world that has a fixed supply cap, and I think that's very well known in the entire crypto community. So Bitcoin has a supply of only 21 million that will ever be mined, whereas gold, dollars, right, they don't have a finite supply. And that's very, very hyper focused on within the crypto community. But the neglected difference that's also makes Bitcoin very unique is this demand side limitation as well. So even though it has a fixed supply, it's also limited in demand. And the reason for that is because the more people that use Bitcoin, the more expensive it gets. And so it's unique in that it's fixed supply, but also unique in that there's only a limited amount of demand before you start to price out certain transactions, because as demand increases, the cost increases, and therefore, lower value transactions become unfeasible to be used for purchases with Bitcoin.
And some folks actually in the Bitcoin, pardon to interrupt, some folks in the Bitcoin community actually just kind of suggested, and I forget which Twitter account published this, but kind of conceded that, how do we say this, that Bitcoin isn't really to be used by those that are maybe with less resources. We used to talk about a narrative: buy your coffee with Bitcoin, or the unbanked and other than first world countries could have access to permissionless wallets and finance with Bitcoin. But now that seems kind of like a non-fact. Would you agree?
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's the way this narrative will inevitably go, because Bitcoin transaction fees have to rise over time to maintain a certain level of security. And so I think you'll see narrative shifts around the Bitcoin specular community to just say, oh yeah, Bitcoin was never intended for that. We knew that all along. Even though like a couple years ago, people did market it as to be used for small transactions like everyday purchases. But that's why I developed this like core thesis of Litecoin being a Bitcoin substitute, is because I knew this was inevitable. I knew that as blocks became full and fees rose, even despite having tools like the Lightning Network and other credit layering solutions, I knew that once the base transaction fee rises, the fees would rise up through those other layers as well. And so there was no real fundamental way to scale Bitcoin. And so there would be a rise for a substitute, and Litecoin was just perfectly positioned to fill that role, just because one, it has a different mining algorithm, so it's not going to compete with Bitcoin in terms of hash rate. Like the Bitcoin miners can't attack the Litecoin network. And then two, it was released in 2011. And so it already had established these network effects for quite a while. And we've kind of seen, if you look at the public blockchain data over the last decade, every time, starting in 2017 when Bitcoin blocks first became full, every time they did, you saw an increased demand for LTC. And we just recently, over the past month or so, with the rise of ordinals, saw that activity kind of explode. And again, Litecoin acted as a substitute. It acted as like the off-ramp or gateway for Bitcoin transactions that got priced out of the Bitcoin network. And what's really interesting is Litecoin transactions actually passed Bitcoin's in the last week.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing.
In total number of transactions. So
yeah, I saw that too. I think a lot of us did, and that's definitely remarkable and a feat. Yeah, very good. I know when we kind of messaged one another, we talked about using Litecoin as money, maybe ordinals, LTC20 tokens, et cetera, and we'll get to that. But what's your case on why does it make sense? And maybe you just sort of answered that. I believe in part you did, but why does it make sense to use Litecoin now versus in the past?
Yeah, so in the past, you really never had a real need, outside of a few times where Bitcoin transaction fees really rose above a level that priced out a lot of transactions. When you have a money that has greater network effects like Bitcoin does, it's more valuable. And if the cost of using it is low, it doesn't make sense to ever use an inferior money. So there's never really a reason to adopt a substitute outside of Bitcoin, because just use the more secure, more widely accepted money. It's more valuable. And so you never saw this reason to use anything else. But now, just recently over the past month, where Bitcoin transaction fees went to like $30, now there's a real reason to swap out of it and use something else. And the thing that's closest and second most secure, second most liquid, second most widely adopted in terms of network effects is LTC. And so it's a pretty easy sale. To me, it's a lot like, and I've compared this in the past, it's like comparing cities to cryptocurrencies, right? Like if you lived in New York and the rent increased by 3 times, in Brooklyn had been growing up and had sufficient network effects, and really the trade-off of living in Brooklyn versus New York City wasn't that big, you'd see a lot of migration over to that second tier city. And so that's what I think is happening. You're just seeing cost rise in like the trade-off of using a slightly less secure network. Makes a lot of sense for people.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also add the fungibility aspect. And we've discussed this again, episode 1 was with David Burkett, who basically wrote the code for the MWEB extension blocks upgrade. And with that, Litecoin now has a fungible, more private layer, which it didn't before. And of course, that Bitcoin does not have on layer 1. They have liquid solutions as a layer 2, but they do not have that as a layer 1. So I think that's another case for Litecoin now versus in the past. And it's actually interesting. Today we're recording this on May 18th. May 19th marks the first year, or I should say year 1 has been complete with MWEB having launched. And again, it's joined the 100% uptime that Litecoin offers, which is pretty amazing. And I would encourage you to listen to episode 1 and episode 4. This is episode 5. If you want to hear a little bit more about MWEB and that upgrade, and also how it relates to ordinals and LTC tokens and some of the congestion we're seeing with Bitcoin and, of course, Litecoin. So, well, very good. The idea of Litecoin as money is a primary one. I believe that's why it was created as a clone, if you will, of Bitcoin. But as Charlie Lee kind of made the analogy early on, it's the silver to Bitcoin's gold. And many people have already conceded that Bitcoin is digital gold. And that, of course, refers to it's like an allusion to the metallic standard, right? The gold standard, which was never actually a gold standard. It was a gold standard with silver and other types of lesser metals in exchange as well. But with Bitcoin and Litecoin being digital gold, digital silver, that also reminds us of what is money and what is money and its relationship to the state. Did you want to go and talk about that a little bit? The separation of money and state as it relates to Litecoin or Litecoin and Bitcoin.
Yeah, I think there's a couple interesting directions to go with respect to the separation of money and state. I think first off, and this is probably one of my most unpopular opinions that I've had for years, and have grown to know that just by interacting online on Twitter, and that's I know a lot of people think that eventually the state will adopt Bitcoin or will get some sort of pro-Bitcoin members of Congress or pro-Bitcoin president in power, and then they will just vote in Bitcoin as like the new gold standard, but instead will just be on a Bitcoin standard. That was a very popular narrative that had been spread around within the crypto community for quite some time. Mm-hmm. But to me, I always disagreed with that concept, because I think if you could vote for better money, then you wouldn't need to pay for the expensive security model that Bitcoin offers to protect itself from government. So if we could solve this solution politically, in my mind, that's a lot cheaper way to do it. And then we wouldn't even need Bitcoin. We could just make a new political money that didn't have inflation and didn't have censorship. To me, the core value proposition of Bitcoin is as a black market money, meaning it can protect itself from the state by being censorship resistant and being basically inflation proof. So I know that's super unpopular, but to me, that's what the security of model of Bitcoin is designed to do. And once people learn the reality of this, I think we'll see quite a bit of a shift, like a bifurcation in the market.
So that's interesting. I'll go on that. So, and I think we're already seeing the foreshadowing of this. There's already been announcements. There's the FedNow system at the Federal Reserve Bank for the Americans who are listening, which would be more so applicable to the United States. That's not necessarily a blockchain, but they've alluded to what form it may take. And then the idea of a central bank digital currency, which would be I would say, well, I don't want to say Bitcoin-like, because I think it's probably nothing like Bitcoin, but it would be a crypto, purely digital. Granted, our fiat system is already nearly 100% digital, but so there's already discussions about central bank cryptocurrencies, CBDCs. So you don't see Bitcoin or Litecoin as adopted by the state. You see them acting in tandem to central bank digital currencies.
I see them more as like polar opposites. Like, I think the governments will try to enforce more control and go the route of central bank digital currencies, because it gives them even more power beyond what they had through the traditional fiat currencies. To me, the real two differences between state money and non-state money is really just the ability, to censor and control where users transact, and then tax them. Those are the two main value propositions of state money to a government. And Bitcoin, to me, is the polar opposite. It allows users, through its decentralized security model, to protect themselves from the government that wants to tax and control where they spend their money. So to me, I don't think they'll ever work cooperatively. I think it's like socialism versus capitalism, right? They're not compatible at all. They're two competing ideologies that want the exact opposite end goal.
Yeah, I would see it as that too, and I would think really the origins of the space. Granted, there's a lot of ideas in the crypto space now versus when Bitcoin was launched or Litecoin was launched. I came in it through the avenue of more of a libertarian model, and some of us remain,
Hmm.
although you don't always see
Hmm.
it anymore in the casino. But yeah, the initial principle
Hmm.
was as you, I think you said, the antithesis of central money or centralized money, fiat currencies. That was the antidote. Really, it was offered
Hmm.
as the alternative system, and here you go, cat's out of the bag. And initially, of course, the narratives
Yep.
was to destroy it. Drug money, terrorists, prostitutes, whatever, evil thing you can attach to it, we will do it, meaning the state actors. And then when
Hmm.
that was unsuccessful, then it's, well, how do we control it and domesticate it? And I think that's still under play, um, and we'll see where it goes. But ultimately, yeah, it is independent. Bitcoin and Litecoin are independent of the state. Now, I imagine the state could invest in
Hmm.
mining equipment, and I don't know how much money it would
Yep.
take. There's probably somebody who can answer that, and maybe if you know, message on Twitter or leave a comment how much energy and money it would cost to literally take over one of these networks. I don't think it would be feasible. Um, but
Yep.
with the resources governments have, especially the United States and its printing press, I don't know really how to answer that. But
Yeah.
as of
It's.
this time, it's decentralized.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Hmm. Exactly. To me, the scariest part is like the longer we stay in this white market phase where we build up these legal white like publicly traded companies that grow bigger and bigger and outcompete smaller miners. So like these major publicly traded Bitcoin mining companies, the bigger they get, I think the easier it is for the state to like capture Bitcoin, because it's very easy for them to go to whoever's the CEO of these companies and say like, hey, we want you to censor these transactions, and like get enough mining pools and mining companies to make it like just outlaw certain, blacklist certain addresses,
Hmm.
um, start censoring transactions. So the longer we stay in this phase where we're all like speculating in the casino and investing money through like Fidelity into Bitcoin, I think the bigger the risk um, to the state, or basically the easier it is for the state to be able to capture that, because it can automatically very quickly with just like enough votes outlaw um, certain types of transactions, or just add an inflation rule change into Bitcoin. And it's up to the independent small miners to kind of
Yeah.
overpower this.
Interesting. And if it was
So.
custodied by a third party as well, you mentioned Fidelity or something else.
Mhm.
We don't typically use Fidelity as a bank, but I know that there were, under the Trump
Mhm.
administration, rules near the end of that administration that was suggestive of banks being able to start custodying crypto assets. We haven't seen a whole lot with it, and I
Mhm.
think it's because the current environment is pretty chilling. Um, but let's say you have a Bank of America account or Citi or Wells or whatever major bank, and you could actually hold your Bitcoin or your Litecoin or your Ethereum, whichever, in that account. You're in the custody of another bank. And if we think of kind of the earlier launch of Bitcoin, around that time was the issue in Cyprus, right? When people were basically getting a haircut with their bank account. Couldn't you do that with your Bitcoin or Litecoin or crypto assets if it's in a bank account? Oh, you have over X amount, we're going to take the difference. It's happened with fiat, and I
Mhm.
think in that environment, you would no longer be operating on a private key system, and they could do the
Mhm.
same thing. Am I wrong?
No, I don't. I think you're exactly right, and I think also, yeah, the more you start pooling into these custodians, the easier it is for government to pass a law that like forces a fork in the Bitcoin chain and makes one chain illegal, and one legal, where they can basically tax the money or inflate the supply. And if you don't actually have your keys and you're not, um, transacting through your own node, like um, you're not going to have any protection against that inflation. So like they can do exactly what they did with gold. Like once they took everyone's gold and nobody transacted with it,
Hmm.
they could say they have a gold standard and back it 1-to-1 with paper. But like once users stop transacting in it and they're relying on all these third parties, then they really don't have much protection against inflation. You're kind of trusting governments are going to be honest, um,
Interesting.
which never happens.
Which doesn't
So
typically happen. Yeah. I have one more thing on that,
yeah, so I
actually.
think, go ahead.
Okay. Um, This was something of topic a few years ago. I haven't heard as much about it now. Granted, I'm not really looking for it now either. But I want to say, is it 2021? One of the Bitcoin conferences. Um, they had some folks talking, and it was in the air more at that time about this idea of a green Bitcoin and should it trade at a premium. And that's something where I think if government was involved, we could definitely see the further destruction of fungibility, whatever fungibility Bitcoin has left with KYC, not a whole lot. You can
Mm-hmm.
only really have fungibility if it's anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, there's problems with that too, but generally speaking. But when you're able to mark one as a, let's say, a dirty Bitcoin versus a green Bitcoin, that's
Mm-hmm.
another level of manipulation on top of this asset, which if I can go the route of Satoshi, I don't think he'd be approving.
No, for sure. Yeah, that's the real risk is, yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen though. I
Yeah.
mean, they are going to try to apply all of the same rules that they do to traditional money to Bitcoin once it's on these like white market legal platforms. There's going to be no value proposition left in the original Bitcoin. It's just going to become like state money, and the real thing that's kind of been frustrating to me amongst the crypto community is I think a lot of the Bitcoin maximalists and just people in general don't really understand how this Bitcoin, like how people actually have to secure the Bitcoin network, like in a distributed, basically anonymous way, and actually have to hide from government when it does inevitably become illegal to transact dirty Bitcoin. Like you're gonna have to resist using the Bitcoin security model as it was intended. So yeah, I don't think that's coming anytime soon, but eventually people are going to have to learn how to use this money anonymously to avoid um, getting in trouble with the government if it is illegal, or you're just going to lose the entire value proposition, and we're going to go back to um, Bitcoin or like state money, but it's just going to be called Bitcoin, like green Bitcoin or whatever.
Hmm. Interesting. So let's
Yeah.
talk about the future with this kind of on our. You mentioned you don't
Mm-hmm.
think it's going to happen now, um, but let's talk about the last 10 years of crypto, roughly,
Mm-hmm.
and the next 10 years of crypto. Can you describe kind of what we saw, where we're at now, and where we're going in terms of Bitcoin or Litecoin, um, and maybe more about that Litecoin as a substitute?
Yeah, for sure. So the last 10 years of Bitcoin are interesting for me to think about because, it kind of started as a result of this financial crisis in 08, 09, right? Bitcoin was released right after that. And it like in its, I can't remember exactly the origin, but it had something about that article of like Chancellor on the
Chancellor on the
brink of
brink of bailout.
bailouts.
Yep. The first
Yeah.
ordinal inscription.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it's ironic because Bitcoin really has acted as the most risky asset, and has benefited the most in terms of price from this easy money policy. Um, so even though Bitcoin really it is a solution um, to it's a that banking bailout crisis and inevitable sovereign debt crisis that we're heading towards, it's really acted for the first really like 13, 14 years of its existence as like the riskiest tool for speculation. Um, and to me, eventually, at some point, I think, and I think to be honest, after this next round of bailouts, if we have another financial crisis, which I think is likely just because we've had such a rapid rise in interest rates
Mm-hmm.
with such a huge level of global debt, like $300 trillion in debt globally, I think will inevitably lead to another financial crisis and a final round of QE that's way bigger than the last rounds. And so I think this next crypto cycle, after maybe some short-term price craziness, but the next 10 years I think are really going to be defined by people really actually having to exit the fiat system because this next round of QE is going to drive inflation to higher than, double digits, 15, 20% plus. And then we'll actually see like the real monetization of crypto, and then a real fight between governments trying to protect their fiat money and central bank digital currencies versus people who are really being impoverished and almost like forced to make this decision. Hey, do I want to stay a victim to this government inflation problem, or am I going to do something about it and try to protect myself and start these smaller closed loop, really free market economies that are technically illegal? I know that was really quick, but that's basically how I see the transition. I see it transitioning from a huge speculative bubble where there's not really any actual monetization going on. It's really just a casino to it actually being monetized. And then Litecoin to me is going to perform really well in that scenario, because once you actually see monetization of Bitcoin, which we haven't yet, like there's not even very many transactions happening on a daily basis. If you look at Bitcoin compared to like worldwide monetary demand, fees are going to go way higher than they are right now. And once people see that, I think Litecoin will be used really as money. And inevitably and eventually, I think will be priced like almost at a 4-to-1 ratio with BTC.
See, that's interesting too, because it's coded to that degree, of course. 84 million. There will never be more than 84 million, not Litecoin, and 21 million Bitcoin. And granted, some of them are actually lost. I think I saw a graphic the other day saying 6 million Bitcoin are lost. And I'm curious what the number of Litecoin that are no longer accessible. I'm wondering what that number is. Interesting. So it doesn't sound like a very bright future, at least acutely under the conditions where inflation is so bad. We really have no other alternative than to, all of the money is bad in terms of government money. Now, maybe we can count gold, silver, and some physical assets that could function and appreciate like a Bitcoin or a Litecoin would. But it doesn't sound like the brightest picture you paint. So maybe two questions. At what point would government say Bitcoin has become a gigantic problem because too many people are running to it? Granted, Litecoin, we'd throw that in. If you have a price. Or maybe it's the alternative where it's gotten so bad where there's no resources or actual ability for governments to stop or prevent or dissuade people from the mass exodus, if that is indeed one of the scenarios.
Yeah, I think on your second question, I don't think we'll ever get to the point where governments just give up. To me, it's governments operate like almost like any business without thinking about it. Like if a business is losing substantial amount of money to competition or something, it's going to have to figure it out to survive and try to adapt. So to me, when a government's losing significant amount of tax revenue because people are leaving their money, it's going to do this like kind of cost benefit analysis. Like how much does it cost us to write legislation to try to prevent this? Well, hardly anything. So we'll try that first. If we can recapture a lot of tax revenue by just writing a law that says it's illegal. And then if that doesn't work, then they'll start spending resources on trying to capture mining outfits, perform 51% attacks. But I don't think they'll ever just give up, because that seems like they just die on purpose, which I've never seen a government in history try to just rescind its power willingly. It takes like revolution for people actually, trying to fight the government, risking their lives. But I've never seen in history a government willingly just surrender its power. And I forgot, what was your first part of the question?
Well, and that's interesting. I want to jump on that too, but for the sake of helping you answer my first question and not rabbit trailing further, is there a price point where Bitcoin becomes a problem for government?
Yeah, I
In other
think
words, it's $100,000, or the million that was thrown around a few years ago. Where is it where it becomes a significant, like, we can't stop this in terms
I
of
don't think they
adoption
care
and
about
people
price.
dogpiling it?
I don't think they care about price. I think they care about losing tax revenue. So like nobody's using Bitcoin to like evade taxation of the money. People are still only transacting with dollars. Hardly anyone's transacting with Bitcoin.
Hmm.
And that's why I think you haven't really seen any major attempts from governments to stop it. Like you've seen them kind of become concerned even with minimal usage of Bitcoin. Um, so to me, I don't think they really care about the price. They're still making a ton of money off of capital gains taxes, and they're not losing hardly any ability to tax through the money. It's not like the dollar is losing a ton of value against Bitcoin, realistically, right? Because people are still mainly transacting in dollars. Still, like 80% of the world trade is done in dollars.
Hmm.
Like, yeah, people are buying and trading it, but that's not hindering. It's actually probably increasing government revenue rather than taking anything away from them. So I think they're fine until it starts to do exactly that. As soon as they start losing money and losing their ability to tax, then they'll care. And then I think the first step of course of action for them is just to write laws because it's free. They just have to sign papers. And then if that doesn't dissuade people and people still opt out and they're still losing money, then you'll have this like war of attrition where they start taxing to fund their own mining operations to try to stop people from using it, so they can start censoring transactions up until the point where like black market miners step in and fees rise enough to mine those censored transactions. But yeah, I think that's the inevitable step. Like step one is just passing laws to ban it, and then step two is, okay, we're still losing a lot of money, we need to start mining.
Do you think at any point they'd incentivize the voluntary giving away a Bitcoin with a, let's say, a CBDC or government issued digital currency peg? Like, here, you will be rewarded with this if you surrender your Bitcoin, and then
Yeah, I
it
think
would be
they'd
in
probably,
it would be
we've
in
seen
government
it. We've seen
custody.
the,
Go ahead.
yeah, we've seen that happen with the gold standard. That's exactly what happened. So we have historical precedent. Yeah, I'm sure they would try that. Hey, like we're outlawing the use of gold, turn it in, we'll pay you this amount. And then like we were talking about earlier, once they have most of the Bitcoin in custody, then they can fork Bitcoin and make the other, like the actual one that is inflation resistant, illegal. But yeah, no, I definitely see them, they could do that. And I think that's why the gold standard failed, because once you give up your money and stop transacting with it and you just accept the government paper that's supposed to be backed by it, then you've just lost the battle. I think that's why gold failed.
Yet silver
I think
persisted legally 30 years after the gold was confiscated by government. So maybe Litecoin has an extra 30 years to go if all things
yeah,
were
maybe,
created
I don't
equal.
know.
No, that was
For
just sort of
sure.
a.
I think though, yeah, I think though that Bitcoin and Litecoin can succeed where gold failed.
Mhm.
Gold failed because it, like, one, you can't transact it. Like you have to transact locally. It's very expensive to transact in terms of like verifying the quantity and quality of the gold, right? So like I say, gold, it's pretty expensive. It's just really difficult to do. But with Bitcoin and Litecoin, you can just run a node. You can verify the quantity and quality of your money for like free, and you can send it natively digitally. And there's, it's invisible, really. Like it doesn't have to be stored physically, so it's harder for governments to find if you have it and you take care of your privacy.
Mhm.
The hardest hurdle is going to be the privacy component of these chains. We need way better privacy solutions, or else I don't know. I think governments could win again this
Mhm.
battle over money like they did with gold.
So, in this situation where government is cracking down on use, let's say we've had the exchange of, you take your CBDC, we take your Bitcoin, then a lot of the Bitcoin is sequestered under the civil authority of the jurisdiction. then you can see where's the activity going. They can clearly see the activity of their own versus all the others that are outside of their purview. It would be really hard to police this. Granted, there is, well, how do I say it? There's been chain analysis for a long time, and obviously government has a significant amount of resources. But still, practically speaking, stopping a decentralized technology like this would be very challenging. And it would also assume that you have to have a gigantic force willing to carry this out. And even in the United States, we are still decentralized, right? We have 50 states, and of the states, there's counties and cities and all sorts of jurisdictions, because you have to police IP addresses, shut down nodes probably through that mechanism. It would be very complex, and it would get down to the individual. So that would take a lot of energy, resource, and time to successfully do that. So it's a gigantic undertaking, hopefully one that would be incapable of ever materializing. But this is a consideration we can think of. Maybe not the brightest consideration, but a consideration of a possible outcome.
No, for sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people didn't turn in their gold when they banned it, and they didn't get in trouble for it. And I'm sure a lot of people still transacted, but I think if you scare the population enough, and you make the punishments extremely high, it's I don't know. I just think I don't know exactly what way it's gonna go, but yeah, I would agree with you. I do think that it costs a considerable amount of resources to really police that, and so what I think is governments would just put extreme penalties on if they do catch you, and then make examples out of their citizens, like the ones that are maybe the biggest tax evaders or whatever, like put them in jail for life or something. I don't know. It could be very extreme, and so they'll make it very risky if you do get caught. But I don't know if the technology and privacy gets good enough, then I think if you lower the risk to the individual, then there's a really good chance that people just ignore what they say.
Well, government certainly can be a coercive entity. We've seen that with money. We've seen that with health. We've seen that with all sorts of things. So I'm hearing what you have to say, certainly. I guess if I can say one ray of light here, that an empire, I will use that language. You didn't specifically say it. Does an empire ever voluntarily recede? I could say perhaps the British Empire did. And then the American Empire rose in its stead. But that was also part of a silver standard going wrong. So the money does bring big things down. And if our money goes bad, I have to wonder if for the sake of survival, we would dial things back and maybe become more reasonable out of necessity. But I could see it. It's a coin toss whether you're in extreme tyranny or maybe a more benevolent system due to the fact that you don't have another option to maybe dial things back more gently. But to be seen. To be seen.
Yeah.
Any thoughts? This is unscripted, but we're talking about money, global commerce, prospects for the future, decentralization. We've talked about Bitcoin. We've talked about Litecoin. Of course, the third in that triad, if you ask me or Indigo, would be Dogecoin. Any thoughts of what would be referred to as a Nakamoto standard, which would be a decentralized digital currency based upon Nakamoto protocols in the absence of state?
Yeah. I've always just thought of them as, and this is like actually coined by Eric Voskuil, but I agree. I think Bitcoin, anything that shares Bitcoin's fundamental like security model and properties, you can call it whatever you want, Nakamoto standard or just a Bitcoin. Yeah, they're all in like the same family tree or whatever you want to call it. They're doing the same thing. And so inevitably, I think you could see, this whole family line of chains, you call like Bitcoin 1, Bitcoin 2, Bitcoin 3, or Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, that become monetized over time. And then inevitably, like what you would see is just this arbitrage where people buy different levels of security depending on, what they need, right? They're going to maximize the value they get or buy the least amount of security they need for their transaction. And I could like foresee a potential where you just have an app with this list of Bitcoin chains, where people don't even really know what they're using. They're just selecting on a slider, like, okay, I want this level of security and I'm willing to pay this price to get my transaction processed. And they wouldn't even probably know what currency they're actually using, because I think long term these currencies will be more stable in purchasing power than others. Just like today, you could probably go to Europe or another country, and people wouldn't care whether they accept euros or dollars or yen. It's all the same to me. They know they're getting money. Maybe mentally they calculate it in dollars and say, oh, I got this many dollars of euros, but I don't think people will really care, like merchants, what they're paid in, whether it's Bitcoin, Litecoin, or Dogecoin, as long as they get the price that they're asking for. And so really it'll just be about whatever they're willing to pay for a specific security level. But to me, yeah, like long term, these Nakamoto coins will all kind of work together.
Indeed, indeed. And it's interesting. You remind me a little bit of David Burkett in episode 1. He's not a fan of Doge, so I don't want to put that in his mouth. But the idea that we'll get to a point of a user experience where you want, like you said, you won't really know what you're sending. You just know it's denominated in the local currency and it's being transacted, and then it's settled. And I'll also add, just in terms of our history in the United States, or America, I'll say the American republics, we didn't always have a Fed. Some of us in our community take that for granted, that everybody knows it. Not everybody may know. We've only had a central bank since 1913, 110 years ago, and we had 2 prior to that, which were on charters and they were expired. And anyway, go look them up. But in the Treasury could mint coinage, and constitutionally, gold and silver was considered the de jure currency of the country. But all sorts of other metals circulated here. Nobody cared. The point was, you gave me an ounce of silver, or an ounce of gold, or a tenth of an ounce, or whatever it was. They didn't care if it came from Spain. They didn't care if the King of England was on it. It didn't matter. The point is, they were getting paid. And I think we could see something like that as well. Let's pivot, if we could, to maybe some more current events with Litecoin. And then I'll go into maybe a final section where we can talk about some of your tweets. Does that sound good with you?
Sounds perfect.
All right, very good. So what excites you? We were talking more of a, again, I'll say it wasn't very, how do I say it? Not the most optimistic conversation. It might be realistic, but not the most fuzzy feeling, when we're talking about hyperinflation, government tyranny, the total state, et cetera. So maybe we can bring it back and talk just about more of the pop with Litecoin and Bitcoin right now, which I would say would be LTC20 tokens and ordinals. What's your thoughts on these new kind of up and coming first chain modifications on Litecoin, or on chain layer 1 modifications on Litecoin?
It is pretty exciting to me, for a lot of different reasons. Like, one, every bull market cycle, we've had some type of speculation on a chain. Mainly it was through Ethereum and ERC20 tokens, ICOs, IDOs, and then there were like decentralized exchange type things on Ethereum. And then we had so much demand for Ethereum type Ponzi's, I would call them, that we had all these other platforms that could launch tokens like Solana and Avalanche and all these other various like Ethereum smart contract quote unquote platforms. But now it's finally like actually happening on Bitcoin and Litecoin. And so to me, one, like what's bringing all this speculation is kind of a reversal in central bank liquidity. So we've seen like a rekindling of quantitative easing, even though they're not calling it that. But every time we have like increase in central bank balance sheets, it seems like you draw in more speculative activity. And what's exciting is that it's finally happening on Litecoin and Bitcoin. And so I think probably if we do end up seeing bullish price action like continuing for Bitcoin, that you'll see even more crazy speculative demand for Bitcoin. ordinals, and that'll push up fees really high, and then you'll see a huge rush to use the same type of ordinal stuff happening on Litecoin. So that's exciting, because if you're a Litecoin holder, that means, you know, price can go kind of crazy and perform almost like what we saw in the 2021 cycle with those smart contract platforms. And then two, what's also exciting is that if we do see bullish price action here, it's the first time we've ever had a bull market while Litecoin is about to have a halving event. So there's a lot of narratives that can really push Litecoin price up in the short run, which is exciting. But as far as like specific use cases for ordinals, I don't know enough about them to really have an opinion. To me, it looks like just random speculation, similar to the ICOs and random smart contract things people were doing in 2021. I don't think, to me, it's hard to believe there's a lot of substance there. Maybe there is, but I mean, how many like actual innovations have we seen that are actually making a difference for humanity since the launch of, I don't know, Ethereum in 2014? Like, what really has solved some fundamental issues that's like really making an impact? I don't even know if there are any. So to me, this seems like more of the same speculative type activity.
A new iteration of hype. It's interesting,
Yes.
but that is part of the the market. And I was talking again with David Burkett in episode 1, where I'm just like, man, if you just scroll through some of these ordinal inscriptions, I mean, it's depressing what's being minted. And but again, I'm not in those markets, so you know what do I have to do with it, right? It's going on despite me.
Yep.
And it is benefiting miners. It's benefiting Litecoin. Luke, on our previous episode, he was saying we're seeing, you know, bull market levels of new addresses and activity. And again, as you stated earlier in this conversation, the Litecoin number of new addresses surpassed Bitcoin. You know, and this is in a bear market. So what happens when it's a bull again? You know, so I think it actually is benefiting Litecoin in terms of just the number go up theory. You know, over time, it's just it's being utilized. You know, Litecoin now has further use cases, and you know, silver, we used it as money. I actually tweeted this earlier today. Silver was used as money. I like to think of silver as money, but weren't there, like, you know, cutlery on kitchen tables, and you can use it as a oral throat spray, or, you know, basically sterilize your medical equipment. There's lots of other uses for it, electronics. So we can kind of have a Swiss Army knife situation with Litecoin, as we've had for the multi-purpose uses of silver or gold.
Yeah, exactly. No, I agree. Yeah, it's definitely helping LCC price action, and everyone in the Litecoin community. If price goes up, you'll get a lot more followers and help you monetize content. It's like, it helps everyone, at least in the short run, and it gets Litecoin's name out there. I don't know long term if that helps, but no, it does excite me, because we're all, obviously, I think most of us are speculating on the chain, and so it's cool to see adoption and like people utilizing it in different ways. But as far as like actual substance goes and long-term value creation, maybe, but I don't know. Like, just, I'm always skeptical, and you could say I'm negatively biased against these things, but I try to be realistic.
I think MWEB was definitely a leap forward for Litecoin. And if you consider, actually, Master tweeted this out earlier today after the Saylor interview, saying that the block size should never change on Bitcoin, and it would be a moral issue because it, you know, it's disadvantage to the miners. And anyway, I don't see Bitcoin adopting an extension block like Litecoin did. I don't see MWEB type technology going to Bitcoin. But we have it, and I do think adding that fungible, more private layer is pretty neat, and I think that is a leap forward. No, it's not perfect privacy; it is not Monero, but I think it's a functional
Mhm.
form of privacy, confidentiality that works, and so I think that
Yeah,
actually was a pretty huge accomplishment in the past year for Litecoin.
for sure. Yeah, 100%. I agree. I think privacy is the biggest issue in Bitcoin right now. And Litecoin, even though it's not perfect privacy, but it's a step in the right direction. And so yeah, no, I agree 100%. That didn't affect price at all and hasn't gotten
No,
really any
it didn't.
adoption. But there's, but again, like the reason for that is that we're still in the casino phase. So like eventually there will be adoption when you need privacy. Nobody really needs privacy right now.
Yeah.
Because they're not trying to break laws. But the laws that we're inevitably going to have to break if you want to use Bitcoin and avoid inflation tax, like there will be new laws passed where you will have to utilize privacy technology, but the market doesn't need it right now. I think it's good to prepare though and develop these technologies as much as you can before we actually need them.
Hmm.
It's like you don't want to get to the game, right? If you're an athlete or something and be totally unprepared, haven't worked out in years, and then you try to, compete at the highest level, and you need to be prepared for when the time is to actually show up and um, use these for their intended purposes.
Yeah, yeah. Another thing would be mobile adoption too. A lot of people aren't really, well, I don't want to say a lot of people. You can look up the statistics, um, but many people find it more convenient to transact with their smartphone or whatever. And currently, there's no MWEB
Mm-hmm.
on any mobile wallets, and
Mm-hmm.
I would think that would be a terrific, future development for the community, whether it's the Light Wallet or Cake Wallet. I think it would make it special sense for the Cake Wallet to do it because they integrate Monero. So if you wanted to kind of do the private, semi-private chain, why not do it there? But we will see
Mm-hmm.
mobile adoption coming for MWeb. I know David Burkett's been working on it and publishing things along those lines. We just have to see it done. That's another
Mm-hmm.
thing. What's your thought? This is totally out of left field right now, but in terms of mobile use, um, I've heard
Mm-hmm.
critics in the past say we shouldn't be using these devices, which are very weak in terms of security, to do transactions. It is better to use. Now, granted, we just had a ledger situation just within the past few days with a cold storage wallet, which there's issue with keys and things like that and backups that's come out, and I didn't read a whole lot into it. I don't use it, but what's your opinion on using, let's say, a computer that's dedicated to cryptocurrency, nothing else, versus your cell phone, which has your GPS, Instagram, Facebook, all of your
Mm-hmm.
cross-pollinated permissions and everything else? What security-wise? And I don't expect you to be a security expert, but can you give us
Mm-hmm.
any idea on that sort of the question? Can you address that question?
Yeah, my opinion on security is really like use whatever level of security you think you need, and it's really up to the individual, like personal preference. Like if you live in a safe neighborhood and you're not worried about any threats, do you need to put gates around your house or lock your door? I don't know, maybe not. But if you live in a different environment where there's break-ins, maybe you have to you know add different levels of security. So for me, I don't care what people use. I don't think it's like necessary all the time to just use desktop computers. I think it really depends on like what you're trying to secure against,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the level of privacy you as an individual want to have. There's better tools than others, but to me it's like ultimately up to whatever the individual wants to do. I think um, if your goal is to be perfectly private and anonymous and have max level of security, you probably don't want to use those mobile devices. But most people don't care, actually. I think like
That's a fair statement. Many
they
don't
might
care.
care in the future though, and so we may need to educate people on why they may want to use higher levels of security and maintain better privacy just in case of, the future where I think we're heading. Maybe you don't want the government to have perfect knowledge of all the assets that you own. And so maybe it's smart to secure them in a way to have privacy just in case. Like, I would say it is kind of dumb to be careless about privacy now because you just don't think you need it ever. And then in the future, like, oh crap, I wish I would have done a better job at maintaining privacy. Now everyone knows everything I have. It reminds me a lot of like social media, where people would put pictures or things online and like, I don't care, anyone can see it. But then in the future, they go to like apply for a job and they don't get it because
Yeah.
they had, I don't know, a bunch of photos that didn't look too appealing. It's kind of like that scenario. I don't know if that's the
Voluntary
best analogy,
surveillance.
but
Yeah, voluntary
yeah, it's
surveillance.
voluntary.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, very good. Let's move it to some tweets. This was from May 10th. All-time high by July. Okay, and another tweet to kind of to tie into this one. The longer we consolidate, the bigger the move. Just a reminder that Litecoin has been consolidating since 2017. So unpack those two tweets for us.
All right. So sometimes like I'm not the most serious on Twitter, although there's like underlying points where I actually do think this is possible. So yeah, one, we've been consolidating since 2017. So like in 2017, we had that run from like $4 to 400, and then we kind of consolidated sideways, like basically retested the all-time high in May of 2021. But there weren't really very many, narratives or reasons around Litecoin for it to actually break all-time highs. All the speculation was happening in Avalanche, Solana, like all these tokens on FTX. Like the whole market was positioned on kind of like the proof of stake side of things. But now, if you look at like the technicals, Litecoin's been one of the best producing assets over the last 6 months. You look at the halving coming up in August, and it's kind of historical price action with respect to what happened during previous halvings. You've seen quite a bit of price gains, and so you have all of these narratives aligning, along with, I think, macro conditions. So basically a reversal in course by central banks to not hike interest rates as much as the market originally expected them to kind of reverse course on quantitative tightening after these regional bank failures and start QE all over again. All of these things point to, for my opinion, just rapid price appreciation in a short amount of time. So that's why I was making those tweets. I don't know for sure. It's all speculation, but it just seems like it's the perfect storm for LTC specifically to finally do really well. And so it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah. Do you have any ballpark where you think it may land?
It kind of depends. Like, honestly, I think if Bitcoin continues up here, and like breaks this $30,000 level and proceeds to all-time highs, I think if you look at the LTC BTC pair, it looks like a similar setup to the Doge BTC pair. It's just on an extended timeline. So Dogecoin had like almost like 100x, I think it's like 70x move against Bitcoin in 2021. And I think Litecoin can do something similar, and maybe not to that extent because it's slightly higher market cap, but I think we can break all-time highs in the LTC BTC pair, just given the fact that fees already went to $30 and we haven't even seen a bullish trend. And if this next round of speculation is all going to happen on the ordinal side of things, which to me seems likely, then yeah, you could see a move similar to Dogecoin for Litecoin in the next 6 months.
Yeah, Litecoin is really the one larger, more established cryptocurrency that hasn't done a move like this. Ethereum
Yeah.
did, and I think Ethereum will continue to probably do well. I mean, I guess the SEC could really make some statements and meddle with things. But with that aside, Bitcoin saw an all-time high. Ethereum already did. I mean, we had an all-time high too, of course. What was it, around 400, just over 400. But in the last cycle, it didn't happen.
Hmm.
Um, so I
Hmm.
think I would agree that, especially with the ordinal situation and just the increased activity on Litecoin, something certainly could be setting up. And I don't put numbers out there. I thought we'd see an all time
Hmm.
high. I want to say in the 2021 end of year, and it never happened,
Hmm.
which was weird.
Yep.
That was the whole. Yeah, that was a weird year. So then I've just kind of been more mum since then. But I still believe over time it's inevitable. I think Litecoin is inevitable, and Bitcoin is inevitable. But of course, I favor Litecoin between the two. And Doge, I think, is fascinating as well. And I've considered it more seriously uh, in the past year or two versus prior to that. But anyway, I digress.
Hmm.
Another tweet, if I could. Again, we're I'm curious. This is a curious tweet. Crypto begins when companies like Coinbase end March 20th.
Yeah, that was just in reference to basically what we talked about earlier,
Mm-hmm.
like the transition from white market casino speculation, which I think all these exchange platforms really are just casinos, to actual monetization of crypto. And so I say the word crypto begins because to me, crypto's main purpose was, as a separation of money and state, a reaction to bailouts. So if that's the intended purpose, we're yet to see that even to the most minimal extent. So I think these white market businesses, like these exchanges, will get regulated out of existence. And if you really believe that Bitcoin's core value proposition is to combat censorship and taxation in the money, then Coinbase isn't going to be the place you're going to do that on. Um, and so there's not going to be any use case for Coinbase outside of speculation. And if that era is ending, then those exchanges will die, in my opinion. I think they'll all get regulated out of existence.
In the United States
So
or in other jurisdictions as well.
I think in all major Western countries, uh, yeah, I think all governments go the same route. I don't think the U.S. is much different from. I mean, I think the U.S. is a little more strict in rules for uh, financial transactions and banking, but I think that's primarily because we have the world reserve currency. But they're all pretty similar nonetheless. They all have the same central bank model. They are doing the same central bank policies. Um, and so I think the responses will be kind of unanimous and in tandem. I honestly think a lot of these countries coordinate, like the G7, the International Monetary Fund. I think they have shared interests, and so I think they'll kind of coordinate these things together with the issuance of CBDCs and outlawing, uh, you know, illegal or making certain types of transactions illegal. I think it'll all be the same in most developed countries.
Very good, very good. Did you want to add anything else to this idea?
Um, Not really. I think we pretty much covered it.
Okay, very good, very good. We'll land the plane here. Before we go, I will say the Litecoin Coffee Club, litecoincoffeeclub.com, also available at the 84 million shop. Roasting day was yesterday, so we will soon have our second batch of 100% Honduras, which is a specialty coffee, single origin from, of course, Honduras, and our friends House Roots Coffee. They're our roaster, and Jimmy Lee will be taking payment in Litecoin for all of the bags that we have secured. Batch one did very well. We have batch two available. Thank you to those who have already ordered it. Please see litecoincoffeeclub.com or again, go to the 84 million .com shop to check that out. And why Litecoin? Since you're on the show, I'll be glad to give you a bag. However, we'll deal with details offline, and I'd be fine for you to designate
Awesome.
it to somebody else if you're not comfortable revealing personals in terms of addresses. But I'm excited about it. We've had a pretty good reception with batch one, and I'm glad to say that batch two is nearly here. So with that said, we'll land the plane. Why Litecoin, thank you for coming on the show. Again, find Why Litecoin at twitter.com/WLitecoin. And any closing thoughts that you may want to share, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it. I've spent a long time away from the Twitter sphere, and I'm finally getting back into thinking about these things again. My subject matter knowledge is probably a little rusty just because my brain's been focused so much on other things in the last, I'd say like last 9 months. But no, I really appreciate you doing this. And honestly, I think you and Grant and other Litecoin community educators will get a lot more volume coming in, especially if price starts doing well. So I think it's good that you started doing this when you did, because I think there's going to be a lot of demand for educational content on LTC going forward if we're right about price inevitably going up. So yeah, best of luck, and thanks for having me on.
Well, thank you for coming. And of course, we're grateful for Grant and the other folks in the community. I echo that, and I look forward to see who we continue to have on the show. And maybe we'll be having you back in the future. I think that would be great as well. So anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in to episode 5 on the 84 Million podcast. We are glad to be here providing whatever education we can about Litecoin, highlighting folks in the Litecoin community, developers in the community. We're just glad to have this resource, and we hope that these are standalone, evergreen episodes that can be of help to you, whether you're tuning in on published date or in the future. So anyway, check us out at 84million.com. Again, if you want to find the 84 Million podcast, go to 84million.com/podcast. You can see some of the latest videos. You can stream directly on the page, and you can find us on Spotify, who else? Amazon, Apple, all the major ones. They're there. Again, I believe there's 13 of them. And on that the podcast page, you can find all of them. So whichever platform you wish to subscribe, please find them there. And with that, we'll let this one go, and see you guys next time.